What's up? Good morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Heading out to Appleton this morning and jam out to a little, listen to a little Book of Mormon audio, and then, stop to grab gas. Got a banana. Trying to stay healthy. Sangelina, what's up, girl? So I don't know. You balance it out, right? I had some candy last night, had a banana this morning. Hopefully, I stay super healthy. That's the idea. Alex, what's up? Good morning. So that's the idea here. So I'm just having a little bit of music here, kind of set the mood, get excited. Hopefully, you can hear me okay. Adam, what's up, buddy? Good to see you. Sometimes, for whatever reason, I think you can't hear me. But morning to you, my friend. So this topic today that's on my mind is about assumptions, right? Some people are familiar with assuming, right? If you assume, you make spell the word out, you make an ass out of you and me. And so a lot of times this comes up because one of the guys I work with, I got on a phone call and from the head manager. And so he had said, hey, give me a call when you get a chance. I want to set up a time where we can chat. And so the advisor makes the assumption that it's about this case that he's working on. And in reality, it's not about that at all. So the interesting thing about it is he assumes that's why this guy's calling. And so he calls back and just says, oh, no need to, he calls his secretary and says, oh, don't worry about it. Don't need to talk with them because I already talked with someone else about this. And it's like, so you have no idea why he called. You're just making total assumptions that that's why he's called. And so that makes it just very, very, you're good on the hearing. Good. Thanks for the feedback, Adam. And so I find that oftentimes I think what people are afraid of is they're afraid to ask questions, maybe ultimately because we're afraid of the answer, right? And so that's why we make these crazy assumptions in our lives. So that's it's just really interesting kind of concepts, is that oftentimes we don't ask questions because we don't want to hear the answer, or we're afraid to go out of our way and actually ask the question because maybe we don't want to come across as not knowing. Maybe we're concerned about the conflict that might ensue. And again, it kind of stems from that scenario in a worst case scenario, in a situation where you don't have all the information and there's a lot of unknowns. We have a tendency to think worst case scenario. So it's interesting just because I think oftentimes we end up making certain decisions based on that fear of not getting the full picture, because we're concerned that if we got the full picture, it's going to be a negative outcome. And so I think where we almost want to come from is having no expectations, right? So for example, let's say I'm working let's say I'm working at work and I want to get a promotion. So instead of talking to my boss about what I need to do in order to get a promotion, I just work hard, assuming he or she sees my hard work, and therein lies the problem, because I never get clarity. They might not even know my intentions. It reminds me actually of my father. Now we had lived in California, went to Chicago, moved to England, moved to Cleveland, then moved to England for 3 years. My dad was all over Europe in regards to his role, and then we came back to Ohio, and then so he got a job when he was around, was he like 52 or something, and was working for this company in Richmond. And he's kind of definitely one of those personalities that he's working hard, and so he assumes that people are noticing. And he had actually told the guys, his boss, and I think there's like one or two steps, like CEO, VP, director, and then there's my pops. And so Pops, talked to the director and the VP and was just telling those two guys, hey, if there's an opportunity to go overseas, I'd love the opportunity. And these individuals were actually surprised because, we never knew that. We didn't think that was something that you had wanted. And my dad, in his mind, he had made the assumption that they knew his resume, they knew his his background, that he had lived in England and managed all of Europe. That's the assumption, right? So the better scenario would have been coming out and saying that right from the get-go when you start getting employed. Like, hey, here's my goal, guys. Like, I want your job and I want the CEO's job. That's my goal. So I want you to help me get there, right? So whatever things you feel I'm lacking, let me know, and I'm going to be able to prove to you that I'm the right person for the job. But without having that conversation, we assume that those above us or those that we associate with already kind of know that, or are in a sense thinking, looking out for your best interest. Now, for example, the problem with, typical hierarchies like that, if I'm a VP, I typically have, directly that report to me, maybe 20 or 30 people. Indirectly, right? Like the entire org, there could be hundreds of employees that report to me. And so I don't know every single individual's desire. In your typical setting, I mean, you're going to get the occasional leader that has that ability, that's reaches out to every single person and really knows them intimately and is looking out for their best interest. Your typical, though, is they're looking out for their own, right? So they might have aspirations to be the CEO or what have you. So I think oftentimes when we make these assumptions, that can be a real Achilles heel in us getting what we want. And the biggest problem that I see these assumptions being made is definitely in interpersonal relationships, right? So husbands and wives, boyfriend, girlfriend, family, father, sons, mother, daughter, father, daughter, right? All these, really, really important relationships, the most intimate, the most important relationships that we truly have. A lot of assumptions are made based on, good intentions. Oftentimes, the struggle that it creates is, again, when you're making these assumptions, you're literally just guessing that you think you might know what they might want. Now, just because past behavior might predict the future doesn't mean that that's always the case, right? Just because my son enjoys a violin today, I shouldn't make the assumption that he loves everything about string orchestra, right? Like, I can't make that assumption. I need to continually check in with him that he's enjoying playing the violin, that he wants to continue to do that, and not make the assumption just because he's doing it right now, that's something that he wants to run with for the rest of his life. At the same time, too, I think it's interesting that we have a tendency to, we want to be the best, but it doesn't mean that my son has to aspire to be, the greatest violin player in the orchestra. He might just want to be a really good player, right? Or he has a desire to learn the violin and then move on to the piano and then move to the guitar, right? Like, he might have a desire to go to a multitude of just different instruments because he enjoys music. If I never check in, though, that becomes communication. It does. It's so key, yet so many times we make these little assumptions. The other thing, I was talking to a buddy yesterday, and he was telling me how he totally got upset with this friend of his. They were talking on the phone, and she had made the comment like, oh, I thought you wanted this, from an order perspective, and he's like, no, like, I want this, and I think she kind of lashed out at him, and then he lashes right back out to her. And I'm like, when I talked to him, I said, I thought this is like a good friend of yours. I thought she's like a big fan. I thought she's a big supporter of you. And he's like, yeah, she totally is. And I said, well, do you think that her comments were meant to be rude and to alienate you or to insult you in any way? And he's like, no, probably not. She probably was just frustrated. And I said, then why did you attack her? Like, why are you all of a sudden just immediately going to, like, hang up the relationship just based on that? And so it was just interesting because immediately he's like, oh my gosh, like, I totally put my foot in my mouth. I totally overreacted. And unfortunately, that's kind of his personality, is he has a tendency to, if feeling like he's pushed, he just lashes out. And it's like, No, you can't do that. You can't have that knee-jerk reaction, because you have to remember the context of where that person's coming from. But yet, so many times in relationships, like, for example, my best buddy, I'll give him all the latitude in the world, right? So he's there to pick me up from the airport. He's like a half hour late. No problem, buddy. Hey, I know you're busy. You got work or whatever, right? My wife, though, she's late 2 minutes from picking me up from the airport, I give her hell. No, I really don't, actually. That's not me. But that's kind of how personal relationships almost are. It's like the most important one, we don't give any latitude, any flexibility, because we have these higher level of expectations. So these expectations that we give to people actually set up the problem. Hope you have an awesome day. Hope you are too, my man. What's up? Thanks for the shout out too, by the way. Appreciate that. So that's where I think oftentimes we run into these issues, and it really does just comes down to just saying what's on your mind in a tactful way. Just because, some people are like, no offense, but right, just because you precursor your big insults with no offense, it doesn't allow us to be able to say the most insulting thing in the world, right? Like, so hey, no offense, but you're the stinkiest human being I've ever smelled in my life. Like, you're disgusting. You can't do that. But we definitely could say, you know what, son? After you work out, you kind of stink. Do you have the right deodorant? Are we using deodorant? Right? Like, oftentimes I'm fascinated how many times people, they assume that someone else, right? Back to assuming, right? Ask out of you and me. We assume that people should know certain things, and in reality they don't. I'm oftentimes, some parents, they have a tendency to belittle their children, or they're always like assuming that they're going to do something wrong, and you really look at it, and that parent has never taught that child to do something, so they're getting mad at that child when nothing was ever taught, and they think, oh, because I told you at one time. Well, how many times have you been told one thing, and expected to memorize it? Probably not many times. Like, you're probably told something over and over and over, and then it comes. That's true. Have a great day, Sherman. You too, my friend. It all depends on the approach. Absolutely. It becomes extremely critical in these, especially in the more personal the relationship, the more flexibility there should be, the more transparency, the more bluntness, the more honesty there needs to be. But yet, and when I mean bluntness, I think that has a tendency to have a negative connotation, that I'm going to say something that's rude. But for me, it's just like, why do I need the context of, like, setting up the stage? Like, look, you're my children. I'm your husband. I'm going to just come right out and say it. I don't need to, like, dress it up in flowery language. I can just say, hey, you know what? I was thinking about, when we engage with the boys, maybe there's a way that you and I could do something where we're doing one-on-one, engagement, maybe like a date night with each child, so that way they feel connected, right? I don't need to, like, set it up. I'm afraid that, like, I might offend her by this comment, right? Like, it's almost like brainstorming. Every opinion is valid. Every idea is useful. It doesn't, like, we can't get attached, but the problem is that we get attached to our ideas, and we think that they're so great that sometimes becomes the problem, is that we feel like, if you shoot down my idea, like in this scenario, hey, let's have date night, and my wife goes, no, I'd rather it be, parents and child, instead of just father and son or mother and son, and all of a sudden, like, I'm offended by that's my own problem, right? Like, I should be the one that really shouldn't be offended by her suggesting a different thing, right? Because if in a context that there's no real right way to parent, then that's really the context, right? That not every idea is perfect. Hey, Sherman, how you doing, buddy? Hope you're doing, absolutely, Phil. Hope you're doing well, my friend. Cheers. Tony Robbins says, if you want to have and keep a good relationship, treat that person the same way when you first met. That's interesting. I guess because in those first engagements, right, we have a tendency to be much more understanding, right? We're looking to really understand their perspective, their points of view. I would definitely say that from a standpoint of sometimes we assume that that person hasn't changed, and we do ever so slightly, right? Like, so 5 years later in a relationship, let's say with a significant other, boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, right? Our partner, what ends up happening though is we kind of treat them the same way when we first met, right? Like, so dudes have a tendency to be like, hey, remember when we were single? And this might be 10 years later. Remember we were single? We used to go out and party hardy. How come we don't do that anymore? And her response typically is, well, now we're married and we have 2 kids. I don't want to go get hammered on a Friday night and then have to deal with kids on a Saturday morning hungover, right? That's why I don't want to go party hardcore on a Friday night. But yet, for whatever reason, the other significant other says, well, I think you should still be that way, right? Like, well, that was 10 years ago, that was 5 years ago. Like, things change, right? Like, oh, I remember when you were super sexy, you used to get all dolled up. Well, I remember too when you used to have hair and it was on your head, not your back. And I remember when you had like a 4-pack or like really flat abs, and now you got like 40 pounds of fat junk in your belly, right? Like, however, we have a tendency to want things like that used to be, like, so we get nostalgic over the past when we don't appreciate the moments as they're happening, right? Like, it's interesting. Like, for me, I have very little emotions. I have very little nostalgia about anything that's even happened. Heck, even yesterday or last week, I don't really give a crap about, right? Like, the moment it's done for me, I'm done, and like I want to move on, right? So, and that's very difficult for a lot of people to understand. Like, if I let's say I had an argument with someone, and I'm like, okay, look, you have a different opinion, I have a different opinion. We're obviously not going to agree on this one. I'm not going to persuade you to see my point of view, and you're definitely not going to persuade me to see your point of view. So let's just move on. The next day, or seriously, within an hour, I'm done. Like, I've moved on from that conversation. I'm like, okay, so how do we move? Let's do something, right? Like, I've totally not forgotten it. I just don't care about it. And so it's finding that balance of like living in the moment at the same time planning for the future. Because although I want to focus on today, I still want to set myself up for that next move. It reminds me very much like a pool game. If you ever play like 9-ball, 8-ball, snooker, it's the same kind of concept. You don't want to just be so focused on that one shot that you forget that you need to set up the next one, because that other opponent is setting up their next move too. And so that's where I think sometimes we run into these problems. And as human beings, is we think either so much in the past that we're always like, I wish things were the way they used to be. Well, they just aren't, right? Like, it reminds me, no offense to like Amish people, but it's like that kind of attitude. Well, I like it when we used to live like a simpler time when there was electricity. Yeah, but we don't. Like, that doesn't exist, right? I'm sure some people don't like cell phones, but guess what? We need to use them in order to get in touch with people. And so it's moving beyond that, right? Like, so for me, like, I do like scrapbooks. There is some video journaling that I'm doing, but it's more for legacy than anything else, right? Like, so a lot of my YouTube videos, I have a lot of private stuff and actually have a journal that I dictate, and because I'm more auditory, I'm not a writer, I'm not a typer, I'm not a blogger. So I dictate everything, and then I put it into a different format. And so that's legacy for me. So that way, if I'm dead, my sons know my thoughts about driving and my thoughts about dating and marriage and about spiritual things and about interpersonal relationships and about business, right? Like, I want to give them like my knowledge right now, today, as I'm feeling it, as I'm engaging with it, and that way, when if heaven for because we're all leased on life, right? Like, I think many people hope to live a long life. The reality is not everybody does. And so, I mean, literally, it could be I'm driving right now and somebody gets blinded by the sunlight and all of a sudden just blasts me right in the, with their car head on. We're both dead, right? Like, under the age of 27, the most common, cause of death under the age of 27 is an auto accident. And so it just can happen, and everyone assumes that, hey, well, I'm in really good shape, I can take care of myself, so it's not going to stop a car from blasting me, and it doesn't matter how strong I am. I could be benching 800 pounds right now. That'd be amazing, by the way. But car hits me, doesn't matter how much I bench, I'm dead. So on that happy note, enjoying the moment, right? The moments that they're happening, and recognizing too that the crap that we go through are moments as well. Like, so at some point they will pass, and unfortunately, some things that we engage with might never pass, and it's us adjusting to that life, right? So, health-wise, right? I might get diabetes, and that might stay with me for the rest of my life, and so I adjust. But the adjustment, I eventually move beyond the adjustment, right? Like, so it reminds me of somebody that, a client that I had actually that quit smoking, and he said literally I put the pack of cigarettes in a freezer as kind of a way to demotivate me from smoking, and it's been there for 22 years. And he's like, it's not that I decided to stop smoking, I just didn't want to pull out the pack out of the freezer. And so, number one, it was amazing that he still kept that pack in the freezer. I think it was more symbolic than anything else. And I think that's kind of how we just adjust, right? And so now, 22 years later, not smoking isn't really a desire of his because he hasn't done it, and doesn't really care to, right? Like, and I think that's really oftentimes how we end up adjusting our lives to a new norm, and then moving forward beyond that, and recognizing that, hey, we need to love things as they're occurring. So totally agree with you. Yeah, good, Adam. Appreciate it, man. Like to know that I'm on point with our conversation today. So that's, assumptions, better relationships. Communication is so key, as Adam mentioned there in his comment. And from that open communication, that dialogue can really create something unique for ourselves. I find it makes us much more understanding, sympathetic, empathetic, compassionate when we actually take the time to see life from someone else's perspective. If we take the time to use our ears and our mouth in the right ratio, right? 2 to 1, listen to what other people are saying and where they're coming from before we speak, we have a tendency then to understand more fully exactly what people are going through, even if we don't have a point of reference for it, right? Like someone might be like, I was abused as a child. My dad beat the crap out of me. I have no context personally for that. I can be very sympathetic just by listening and wanting to understand what it was like emotionally for them to go through it, if they're willing to share that with me. I'm not, because my childhood was awesome, it was different. At the same time, they have no context then for an awesome childhood where mom and dad were fully engaged, loving, and exemplified that love, not in a abusive way, verbally or physically, right? So for them to be able to create that in their own family is going to be much more difficult than it is for me. And at the same time, then I would say then the expectation of me is to create even greater amounts of love and patience and acceptance and encouragement and support, because I got such a nice level of it. I need to be able to pass that on to another level, right? And so there's much more expectations I have of myself to be a much better parent than if I didn't have that kind of engagement. Where and maybe that's where that individual doesn't necessarily need to be at my level, but literally like breaking that cycle of verbal and physical abuse might be that might be the biggest win for that individual. And I think that this concept, it's not just familial, it also incorporates really into any relationship that we might be having, whether that's professional or personal. It's having that ability to communicate with people and truly listen. Oftentimes people are just waiting to talk. Truly listen to what people are saying. It's game still going strong. Yeah, absolutely, Alex. So it's from that context, I think, that if I take that strong communication skills, that strong listening skills into the workforce, into my career, I have a tendency to be a much better either a much better employee, a much better boss, a much better leader, a much better manager, because I come from the standpoint of, it's literally one of the 7 habits of highly effective people. It's seeking first to understand, right? So it's seeking first to see something from someone else's perspective, then to be understood, right? First seek to understand, then to be understood. And so it's all about you, Alex and Adam, then it's about me, right? So as I talk to you about your perspective, I might find we're totally on point, right? Like, I find this very similar to spirituality, religions, right? Religions have a tendency to be like, oh, this is how we're so different. But if they go from a standpoint of, tell me about your faith. Okay, this, that, the other thing. Okay. Hey, we're actually on the same, we actually have a lot of similarities. Like, ultimately, most religions say, hey, you know, whatever you are, good, bad, or ugly, personality-wise, not physically, we want to make you better, right? That's really the basis for almost every religion out there is the betterment of those that attend. And so that can be through rules and rules and laws and commandments, and so it's just very interesting that we often focus so heavily on the differences, the chasm that makes us different. We don't recognize there's these massive bridges that actually connect to all these similarities throughout religion. So it's very interesting. He said the tie game, yeah. Tie game. That's nice. Thank you. the game. That's funny. Thanks, man. I like this one. I'm a big fan of this one. It actually got this one from Kohl's. I think I got this on clearance. This is a $10 one, and it actually came with a pocket square. So I really like the floral pattern, and I just really like the turquoise. It's got a strong color to it. So, all right, everybody. Hey, I'll let you go. Peace out. Have a great day.
Instagram Live, right?
Yeah, you betcha.
All right.